In this video, we will be discussing the flawed research techniques of the Orion correlation theory. Greetings. My name is Stephen Myers, and I am the founder of the Pharaoh's Pump Foundation. In this video, I will be presenting information concerning the problems with the research methods used by the Orion correlation theory. As always, on these public service YouTube videos, my good friend Harley is manning the control booth. So since Harley is in the control booth, anything that goes wrong is his fault. Thanks for the broad shoulders, Harley. We needed that. And thanks, Harley, for coming up with this catchy title for this video. Harley is so clever that way. He helps a lot. Simply put, the Orion correlation theory is essentially a collection of correlations between the Great Pyramid as well as other major pyramids on the Giza Plateau and various stars and the cardinal directions and anything else they can come up with. This video is not to explain in detail every aspect of the Orion correlation theory. This video will focus on the flawed research techniques used to conjure up these made-up Great Pyramid correlations that have no causation. It is not just okay to be concerned with research methods, but it is imperative for a researcher to do his or her utmost to use the highest quality research methods possible. Here is a quote from this guy. A lot can be learned from this quote. The quote indicates there are standards of evidence that are high, and it is preferable to use high standards of evidence instead of low standards of evidence. This quote indicates that it is best to hold ourselves to high standards of evidence to be taken seriously. That seems fair enough. But the reality is that the Orion correlation theory has failed to meet that challenge because this so-called theory uses low standards of evidence as the research methods of choice. The result of choosing low standards of evidence is that the Orion correlation theory will never be embraced by mainstream scholars. The Orion correlation theory has not and never will be accepted by mainstream scholars because the poor research methods used by the Orion correlation theory. Also, these poor research methods will result in the Orion correlation theory being rejected by the general population. So let's look at the low standards of evidence and the flawed research methods used by the Orion correlation theory. By the way, you can use any of the graphics used in this video. Just pause the video and do a screen capture and crop it down to show just the graphic. On a computer, simply press the print screen and paste it into the image editor and then crop the image so just the graphic shows. Or create your own graphic and share them on the Facebook or social media platforms. The subject of research techniques is a difficult subject to address and discuss with people who embrace these made-up Great Pyramid correlations, and it should not be. Research methods and standards of evidence should be as easy to discuss and analyze as the research the standards of evidence produce. My experience is that discussing the research methods used by the Orion correlation theory is a subject that is met with a lot of resistance and hostility. This is in stark contrast to other areas of research. Discussing the research methods used in everything from the medical field to metallurgy or virtually any other field of study does not elicit the anger and hostility as trying to discuss the research methods used by the Orion correlation theory. Yet, in regards to the Orion correlation theory, it seems that it is a forbidden subject to discuss research methods. This active resistance to analyzing and understanding the research methods used by the Orion correlation theory is in direct opposition to this quote from this guy who indicates we should strive to use the highest standards of evidence possible. Analyzing the standards of evidence used is necessary to achieve the goal of using high standards of evidence and rejecting low standards of evidence. Yet the correlation believers I've encountered do anything and everything to avoid that analysis. What, Harley? Okay. He wants me to get on with it and quit yammering away. So let's begin our analysis of the research methods used by the Orion correlation theory. The Orion correlation theory is essentially a collection of perceived correlations associated with the Great Pyramid, stars, and other pyramids on the Giza Plateau. Correlations are important to the Orion correlation theory. That is why correlation is in the name of the theory. But what is a correlation? What does the word mean? Why are correlations significant? So much so that it is part of the title of a theory. Is a correlation evidence to prove something? But first, let's find out what is a correlation. This may be hard to believe, but correlations are not evidence. The direct physical evidence, for example, is the entirety of the Giza Plateau. That is direct physical evidence. Strictly speaking, there are no correlations on the Giza Plateau at all that are direct physical evidence. That is hard for some people to comprehend, but it shouldn't be. You can touch a Great Pyramid casing stone. It is direct physical evidence. You can't touch a Great Pyramid correlation because correlations are not direct physical evidence. Correlations are something other than direct physical evidence. Correlations are an interpretation of direct physical evidence. Correlations are a mental conceptualization and nothing more. So, a correlation is not direct physical evidence. A correlation is interpretation of direct physical evidence. That is why the quote from this guy is so important. The issue is whether or not the research methods used, in other words, standards of evidence, by the Orion correlation theory is of a high standard, which is preferable, according to this guy, compared to a low standard of evidence. From this guy's quote, we know there are high standards of evidence, which he feels we should strive towards, and low standards of evidence, which are unacceptable and should be avoided. That seems both reasonable and imperative to produce high-quality research. This concept is so important that he admonishes people to avoid at all costs low-quality standards of evidence. All of this begs the question, what research methods or standards of evidence are used by the Orion correlation theory? If nothing else, proponents of the Orion correlation theory should be able to both identify and avoid using low standards of evidence that this guy wants us to avoid. Also, proponents of the Orion correlation theory should be able to both identify and use high standards of evidence. As we will see, that is not the case, although it should be. Although it shouldn't be, getting an answer to the question, what research methods or standards of evidence is used by the Orion correlation theory is harder than you think. That question is a tough nut to crack, but we will do our best in this video. The Orion correlation theory is a collection of correlations that the followers of the theory consider to be both intended to be significant and valid, seemingly without question. Also, these perceived correlations are considered to be evidence that provides proof the builders of the Great Pyramid intended these perceived correlations to be significant. The significance might be interpreted to be symbolic or religious, or these correlations are considered to have been intentionally created to tell us something profoundly significant, like they knew pi or the size of the earth or the length of the year or whatever. Those who believe the Orion correlation theory believe these correlations are valid, and the correlations are evidence, which indicates the correlations are intended to be significant to the original builders. So, that brings us back to this important question. What research methods or standards of evidence is used by the Orion correlation theory? The Great Pyramid correlation believers contend that the correlations are valid, but what process was used to get to that position? What standard of evidence or research method is used to validate a Great Pyramid correlation? To answer that question, we will first examine the research methods or standards of evidence mainstream scholars use. We are doing this because this guy feels it is important to use the high standards of evidence used by mainstream scholars. So how else can we identify and use high standards of evidence that this guy thinks we should emulate? And how else can we identify low standards of evidence that this guy thinks we should reject? Understanding the high standards of evidence used by mainstream scholars enables us to use these high standards of evidence that this guy advocates we use. In the realm of legitimate academic research that this guy refers to, mainstream scholars that he feels others should emulate use a high standard of evidence or research technique to evaluate or even invalidate a correlation. This high standard of evidence or research method is used by all fields of research, from medical research to metallurgy. The high standard of evidence used by mainstream scholars is to use correlations that establish a relationship between two things that are being compared. Mainstream scholars use correlations all the time, and it is an effective research tool. Correlations are a pivotal tool to understand the relationship between things in biology, physics, and virtually every other scientific study. But what mainstream scholars do, that is a high standard of evidence, is they pair each correlation they contend is valid with an additional piece of data. This additional piece of relevant data is paired with the correlation and is used to validate the correlation. Mainstream scholars that this guy wants people to emulate use this additional relevant piece of data to validate a perceived correlation. Pairing this additional piece of data to a correlation is a high standard of evidence that validates a correlation in the realm of mainstream scholars. That independent piece of data used to corroborate each correlation has a name. This piece of data is pivotal to validating a correlation in the realm of mainstream scholars, and without that piece of relevant data, a correlation can be perceived and even exist in someone's mind, but still be invalid. Yes, a correlation can be invalid. That piece of data is called causation. Causation is necessary to validate a perceived correlation. Mainstream scholars that the quote from this guy indicates people should copy contend correlations must be accompanied with a valid and relevant piece of data to validate a correlation. The data that provides causation links the two things being compared, establishing a valid causal relationship between those things compared in the correlation. So, pairing a correlation with relevant and valid causation is a high standard of evidence that is used by mainstream scholars. And it is a high standard of evidence that evidently this guy thinks that people working on an alternative view of history should also use. Here are some additional concepts that mainstream scholars understand about correlations. These concepts are characterized as high standards of evidence. There are two main types of correlations. What are those two main types, you ask? Those two main types of correlations are correlations that are valid and correlations that are invalid. A correlation can be invalid, false, fake, contrived, wrong, and phony. A correlation can be perceived, yet it still can be invalid. A correlation can be precise, yet it still can be invalid. A correlation without causation is a common logical fallacy. All of these features of correlations are well understood by mainstream scholars. If you believe Great Pyramid correlations, yet are not sure what a correlation is or how causation is used in the process of validating a correlation, then you have been poorly educated. The authors of books you have read about Great Pyramid correlations have done a disservice to you if you are unsure about how correlations are validated or invalidated by legitimate academic scholars who use high standards of evidence. This video's purpose is to address that disservice you have experienced at the hands of Great Pyramid correlation without causation book authors. If authors who wrote books about Great Pyramid correlations took this quote from this guy seriously, then the readers of books about Great Pyramid correlations would be well versed about high standards of evidence and well equipped to avoid low standards of evidence. That is obviously not information Great Pyramid correlation book authors have conveyed to their readers. Mainstream scholars understand that a perceived correlation does not even imply a causation. If a correlation is seen or discovered, it means nothing. I am going to say that again because it is an example of high standards of evidence this guy wants us to strive towards. Mainstream scholars understand that a perceived correlation does not even imply a causation. If a correlation is seen or discovered, it means nothing, unless there is an applicable and legitimate piece of evidence providing causation to validate the perceived correlation. What, Harley? Yes, I know. Harley wants you to know that they even make t-shirts about this. Wow, it must be important if they make t-shirts about it. This legitimate research method or high standard of evidence used by mainstream scholars must be what this guy admires and wants alternative researchers to emulate based on this quote. He also warns us not to use low standards of evidence or poor research methods that mainstream scholars reject. Okay, we are making progress. We know an example of a high standard of evidence used by mainstream scholars that we are also supposed to use as well. It seems not just okay, but important to use this high standard of evidence of pairing perceived correlations with a relevant piece of data or direct physical evidence that provides validation for a causational relationship between the things being compared in the correlation. Let's compare this specific high standard of evidence used by legitimate academic scholars with the research methods used by the Orion correlation theory. Since correlations are pivotal to this theory, we'll simply pick one out and see what standard of evidence or research methods was used to determine if the correlation embraced by the Orion correlation theory is valid or invalid. Any of the many correlations will do. Hey, Harley, pick out a correlation. Pick it out and we'll discuss it. What? He wants me to pick it out? No, Harley, you pick it out. You're the one in the control booth. You always want more involvement in the creative process, so go ahead and choose a correlation you want us to discuss. Okay. You want to discuss the perceived correlation of the vents pointing to stars. Okay, Harley. We will do it your way, and we will see what standard of evidence, either high or low, was used by the Orion correlation theory to somehow validate this perceived correlation. We have all seen the TV documentaries and read the books and even saw images on the internet and Facebook about the vents of the Great Pyramid supposedly pointing to various stars. So the two things being compared to each other in the form of a correlation is the vents of the Great Pyramid and stars. I guess you could call it the vent-star correlation. Let's examine the evidence. It is okay to do that because it is a technique that mainstream authors used as a research method that this guy wants people to emulate. The four vents of the Great Pyramid are not straight, and stars cannot be viewed from the interior of the Great Pyramid through these vents. The vents are not straight, and in fact, all four vents make a number of bends. The King's Chamber vents extend up to at least where the interior stones met the casing stones. If this, it is unknown now if the King's Chamber vents did or did not exit through the casing stones. The upper ends of the Queen's Chamber vents do not exit the Great Pyramid. The lower ends of the Queen's Chamber vents were blocked by the original builders. There are stars in the sky. That is the direct physical evidence concerning this perceived correlation between the stars and the vents of the Great Pyramid. Yet, somehow, Great Pyramid correlation proponents say that there is a valid correlation between the vents of the Great Pyramid and stars, and this perceived correlation was intended to be significant to the original builders. Well, let's use the high standard of evidence used by mainstream scholars in regards to correlations that this guy wants us to use based on this quote that he made. Mainstream scholars are trained in using valid research techniques and know that perceived correlations can be either valid or invalid. Mainstream scholars are trained in using research techniques and know that a perceived correlation does not even imply a causation. Mainstream scholars are trained in using valid research techniques and know that a precise correlation does not even imply a causation. Mainstream scholars are trained in using valid research techniques and know the existence of a relevant additional piece of evidence is needed to provide causation to validate a perceived correlation. That is examples of high standards of evidence. Okay, that seems fair and even desirable to use these high standards of evidence to produce research that is valid. So, what is the additional piece of direct physical evidence specific to the Great Pyramid, which is used as the causation to validate the perceived correlation between the vents of the Great Pyramid and the stars? I have taken what this guy says in his quote to heart. I have conducted research on the standards of evidence used by the Orion correlation theory, and I know that there is no direct physical evidence specific to the Great Pyramid indicating there is any intended significance to the so-called Great Pyramid vent star correlation. There is no direct physical evidence contained in the Great Pyramid structure which provides causation to validate this perceived correlation. There is no physical evidence provided by the Great Pyramid indicating this made-up perceived correlation was intended by the original builders to be significant or valid or even intended. What, Harley? I know. Proponents say the vents point to these stars, and those stars are significant, so it must be intended to be significant, and this somehow validates the correlation. Well, let's look at the evidence. The evidence indicates that the vents are not pointing to those stars, not even close. The vents are pointing away from those stars considered to be significant. So there is no real physical evidence specific to the Great Pyramid, which would be causation to validate a vent-star correlation to any of the many stars these vents have and will point to. This is a hard concept for people who believe this correlation was intended to be significant or valid. The vents are not pointing to those stars. In basic terms, because of the grand precession, also known as the precession of the equinoxes, about every 72 years, the constellations move across the sky 1 degree. So in 720 years, the stars moved 10 degrees. In the last several thousand years, the stars have moved a lot, and the vents are not pointing to those stars that are considered to be significant. The vents are pointing away from those stars. The vents of the Great Pyramid were designed intentionally. The result of that design is that the vents are pointing away from those significant stars. Correlation proponents argue that they did point to those stars. Remember now, we are trying to find out the standard of evidence used by the Orion correlation theory to validate a correlation. They say that nothing on the Great Pyramid is accidental and everything is intended. So if the vents did point to those stars, then it was intended and significant and validates the correlation. In conversations on this subject, I have been told about the intentional design of the vents, and the vents point, or at least used to point to, those specific stars. In trying to find out the standard of evidence used to validate the correlation, I ask, if a vent pointing to a star indicates the vent was intended to point to the star, does that validate the star-vent correlation? They say yes. The vent pointing precisely to, or had pointed precisely to, the significant star is what validates the correlation. Great Pyramid correlation proponents say that the vents pointing to or did point directly at those stars, and that evidence validates the star-vent correlation. I guess that must be the standard of evidence used. The vents were intentionally designed, and through the years the vents have pointed precisely to many, many stars. There are a lot of stars in the sky, and the vents have pointed to a lot of them. So using the standard of evidence used by the Orion correlation theory, all of the stars the vents have pointed to are significant, and the correlation for each and every of the hundreds of stars the vents pointed to, or will point to, are valid using that standard of significance. The people who I have talked to who believe made up Great Pyramid correlations start to backpedal and say, no, it is only the significant stars that the vents use to point to those are the only stars the vents were intended to point to, and that is the only star-vent correlation which is validated, even though the vents are pointing away from those stars and are pointing towards other stars. But that standard of evidence relies on a valid correlation between the Great Pyramid and those supposedly significant stars. Still trying to find out the research methods or standards of evidence used by Great Pyramid correlation believers, I ask, is there a feature specific to the Great Pyramid, in other words, causation, which indicates it is only the stars considered to be significant that the vents are supposed to point to? If so, then what would provide direct physical evidence, leading credence for the supposed vent-star correlation? Pick out a star, Harley. Okay, you picked out Orion. I'm still trying to understand the standard of evidence that validates a correlation between not every star the vents are or have pointed to, but only vents pointing to the stars considered to be significant. I ask, is there a feature or piece of direct physical evidence specific to the Great Pyramid which indicates that the builders intended a relationship between Orion and the vents of the Great Pyramid? Orion correlation believers instantly answer yes. They tell me a vent of the Great Pyramid points to, or did point to, Orion. I remind these people that the vents were intentionally designed, and the result of that intentional design is the vents are pointing away from Orion and have pointed to or will point to hundreds of different stars. So just picking out one of the hundreds of stars the vents have and will point to and just proclaim, Shazam! It's a correlation, is an example of using a low standard of evidence. Then the correlation believers say that the builders either worshipped Orion or held Orion in high standard, in high regards, and that validates the vent star correlation. Still trying to understand the standard of evidence or research method used to validate a Great Pyramid correlation, I try to find out the piece of direct physical evidence that can be used as causation for the vent star correlation. So, so I ask, is there a feature specific to the Great Pyramid which indicates the builders intended the Great Pyramid to be used for religious purposes? The correlation believers say yes, there is. The Book of the Dead, which is a religious document which makes cryptic references to the Great Pyramid, proves that the Great Pyramid is a religious building and that the vents intentionally pointed to Orion for a significant purpose, which makes the vent star correlation valid. In trying to understand the standard of evidence of the Orion correlation theory, I respond by asking this question. Is there a feature specific to the Great Pyramid which indicates the builders intended the Great Pyramid to have any relationship with the Book of the Dead? They respond by saying yes, and that the Book of the Dead is interpreted to refer to the Great Pyramid. But that's not what I asked, and the question was not answered. The reality is that there is no feature that is specific to the Great Pyramid which indicates the builders intended any relationship between the Great Pyramid and the Book of the Dead. If there was such a feature or piece of evidence specific to the Great Pyramid indicating the Great Pyramid had some relationship to the Book of the Dead, correlation believers would have said what that direct physical evidence was. But there isn't any. By then, the correlation believer acts astonished that I even question the validity of made up correlations that he thinks are valid. By this time, the precision card is played. I am told by Great Pyramid correlation believers that the correlations must be true because they are so precise. Trying to find out the standard of evidence used to validate a perceived Great Pyramid correlation, I ask, does precision validate the Great Pyramid correlations you embrace? They nod yes, knowing that precision cannot be questioned. But in the realm of scholarly research, it is okay to question a correlation, even if it is precise. To question a precise correlation that seemingly has no causation is a high standard of evidence used by mainstream scholars. Precision is not causation. Precision does not even imply there is a causation for a correlation. In fact, all invalid correlations are precise. Here is a link that provides a whole bunch of correlations that are precise, yet they are invalid. These precise correlations are invalidated because they lack causation. Only a Great Pyramid correlation without causation believer would argue that these precise correlations without causation are valid. But then, correlation without causation believers use their ace in the hole. They pull out their best argument to somehow justify believing these made up correlations without causation. They say that because there are so many of these Great Pyramid correlations without causation, they all must be valid. Remember, we are trying to ascertain what the standard of evidence is that is used to somehow validate Great Pyramid correlations. Is contending that because there are so many made up Great Pyramid correlations, they must all be valid? A research method used to validate correlations without causation? Great Pyramid correlation believers say yes. But is believing a bunch of made up Great Pyramid correlations without causation, because so many of them have been made up, a high standard of evidence that mainstream scholars would use? Is believing a bunch of made up Great Pyramid correlations without causation, because so many of them have been made up, a high standard of evidence that this guy says we should strive for? Is believing a bunch of made up Great Pyramid correlations without causation, because so many of them have been made up, in reality a low standard of evidence that mainstream scholars would reject? I would submit that contending that there are so many made up Great Pyramid correlations without causation, so they must all be valid, is a low standard of evidence. This guy suggests that low standards of evidence should be avoided. I'm writing a magazine article about the many precise correlations between the Great Pyramid and Elvis Presley. This collection of correlation is called the ECT, or the Elvis correlation theory. I wonder how many precise Great Pyramid Elvis correlations without causation it would take to make them all valid. That is a question best answered by people who are believers in Great Pyramid correlations because they are precise. By then, the conversation inquiring into the standards of evidence of the Orion correlation theory generally de-evolves into an Abbott and Costello who's on first routine, instead of a coherent analysis of the standards of evidence used by the Orion correlation theory.
We have who's on first, what's on second, I don't know's on third.
That's what I want to find out. I want you to tell me the names of the fellows on the St. Louis team.
I'm telling you, who's on first, what's on second, I don't know's on third.
You know the fellows' names?
Yes.
Well, then who's playing first?
Yes.
I mean the fellow's name on first base.
Who?
The fellow playing first base for St. Louis.
Who?
The guy on first base.
Who is on first?
Well, what are you asking me for?
I'm not asking you, I'm telling you, who is on first?
I'm asking you who's on first.
That's the man's name.
That's whose name?
Yes.
Well, go ahead and tell me.
Who?
The guy on first.
Who?
The first base.
Who is on first?
Have you got a first baseman on first?
Certainly.
Then who's playing first?
Absolutely.
Okay, we're back. Actually, getting an answer to what research techniques are used to somehow validate made-up Great Pyramid correlations is a difficult task. This is because the research methods or standards of evidence are very, very low and very sloppy. And these low standards of evidence are rejected by mainstream scholars. Harley, silence your phone. We are busy taping here. What, Harley? We have a caller? Can such a thing even be possible? How can that be? This isn't a show with people calling in. We're just making a video. But we are taping live, so I guess anything can happen. Tell the caller we're busy and we can call back later. What'd you say, Harley? The caller says he wants to talk about research methods used by the Orion correlation theory. Harley, this is impossible. How can that be? People who believe these made-up Great Pyramid correlations without causation refuse to discuss the low standards of evidence they use to justify believing invalid correlations. Generally, people who believe these made-up Great Pyramid correlations would rather let their heads explode instead of shedding light on the poor research methods used to make up fake Great Pyramid correlations. Harley, I want to talk to this guy. This is amazing. Patch him in on the phone. I'll talk to him right now. What? It's a video call? Wow. Okay, Harley. Patch him onto the screen and we will interview him right now. Ladies and gentlemen, this will be an important interview. I have the honor and privilege to interview someone who believes Great Pyramid correlations without causation are valid And we'll also discuss the research methods used to somehow validate these correlations without causation. I have so many questions. Okay, Harley. Uh, you patching them through? Okay, here they come. Greetings, sir, and thank you for calling in and being on our video that we are taping live. I've never had a guest on our one of our videos or in our studio such as yourself. Harley says you are a great pyramid correlation without causation believer. My first question is, what is the research method used to validate Great Pyramid correlations without causation that you contend are valid? I also want to know if your research method is a high standard of evidence or a low standard of evidence. Dude, are you okay? Oh, yuck! Ooh, that was gross. Well, I would definitely say that concludes our interview. Evidently, when push comes to shove, that Great Pyramid correlation without causation believer would rather let his head explode than discuss the flawed research techniques used by the Orion correlation theory. Thank the God of valid research techniques, that guy was not here in Studio B of the Pharaoh's Pump Foundation. That would have been an awful mess for you to clean up, Harley. You're in the control booth, and that means everything that goes wrong is your fault. The interview provided a wonderful object lesson for you, the viewer. Anyway, you don't have to be that guy. You don't have to believe fake, made up Great Pyramid correlations without causation that modern people conjure up who use poor research methods. You don't have to stuff your mind with so many fake correlations manufactured with poor research methods that it makes your head explode. Instead of being a slave to fake correlations, you can be free and your own master. All that it requires is for you to use valid research methods. Yet, many do not want to be their own master and would rather simply believe in correlations without causation, manufactured using flawed research methods. Trying to discuss the research methods or standards of evidence of how the perceived correlations of the Great Pyramid of the Orion correlation theory are somehow validated is like trying to talk to the Jehovah Witnesses who knock at the door. So there is this dirty little secret about the made up correlations of the Orion correlation theory. The Great Pyramid vent star correlations, like all the other Great Pyramid correlations perceived or conjured up by the Orion correlation theory, has no causation. Isn't that interesting? When examining the standards of evidence used by the Orion correlation theory, it is important to realize these made up correlations have no causation. The reality is that no one ever even pretends that made up Great Pyramid correlations have causation. In the realm of mainstream scholars, it is a high standard of evidence of having causation to validate a correlation. Yet, the Orion correlation theory does not use that high standard of evidence. They have settled for a low standard of evidence. People, as well as book authors who ascribe to the Orion correlation theory, don't know or don't care that correlations without causation are a common logical fallacy. In other words, relying on correlations without causation is a low standard of evidence and an unacceptable research method in the realm of mainstream scholars. Yet, this low standard of evidence is the modus operandi for the Orion correlation theory. Harley. Hey, Harley, silence your phone. We're taping here. What? You say we have a caller? Can such a thing even be possible? We're taping live here in Studio B of the Pharaoh's Pump Foundation. How can we have another caller? Harley says he doesn't know. But we do. I guess anything can happen when we tape live. Transfer the caller here and we will take care of it now. I try to make myself available to the general public and my fan base. As of this taping, I have been on well over 100 radio talk show interviews discussing my research in books and documentaries about the Great Pyramid water pump. Also, the subject of the logical fallacies of the Orion correlation theory is a very hot topic right now. If you need a guest for your radio show, you can contact me through our foundation's website. Patch the call through, Harley. What? Another video call? Okay, put it on the screen. Stop talking about research techniques. Don't say anything about the low standards of evidence used to make up
Wow.
Great Pyramid
Okay, Harley.
correlations without
This
causation.
caller's out of control.
Quit it! Cut Stop!
the video
feed. There is no way to discuss the flawed research techniques of the Orion correlation theory with someone as incoherent as that. But that is essentially the response I get from Great Pyramid correlation without causation believers who I have encountered. That is the response I receive from advocates of low standards of evidence. Besides the low standard of evidence of correlations without causation, there are other research techniques that the Orion correlation theory embraces that are also low standards of evidence. Another example of a low standard of evidence used by the Orion correlation theory is that they contend that a correlation is valid if it is precise. Let me say that again. Orion correlation theory believers use the low standard of evidence of a correlation is validated if it is precise. In fact, it is this low standard of evidence that is the research technique of choice used to conjure up correlations without causation and to somehow validate correlations without causation. Let me explain. These Great Pyramid correlation believers sit in front of their computers and fiddle with the dimensions and fiddle with the units of measure and then compare these data points with anything their little heart desires. They come up with a correlation between two things that are unrelated, having no causation. Yet, by using every unit of measure and every conceivable piece of unrelated data, they come up with a correlation that is precise and then proclaim, Shazam! It's a correlation. Contending that the precision of a perceived correlation is what validates the correlation is an example of a low standard of evidence. So is that a high standard of evidence that this guy wants us to use, or a low standard of evidence that this guy wants us to avoid? Let's look at another example. Although the vents of the Great Pyramid are precisely pointing to stars right now, Great Pyramid correlation believers contend that the vents did in the past point precisely to other significant stars, and that the precision of the correlation validates the perceived correlation. So that means the standard of evidence for a Great Pyramid correlation and the research method used to validate a Great Pyramid correlation is precision, validates a correlation. In conversations with Great Pyramid correlation believers, I have been told that the precision of Great Pyramid correlations is what validates those correlations, making them indisputable facts. But what we are interested in is if using precision to validate a correlation is a high standard of evidence that mainstream scholars use that this guy wants us to emulate, or is using precision to validate a correlation a low standard of evidence which is rejected by mainstream scholars that this guy wants us to avoid. Let's find out. First of all, some sort of perceived precision between two things is not causation. Precision is just precision and does not imply a relationship between two things being compared. Here is an example of a precise correlation that is invalid. A micrometer spindle turns 40 times to travel 1 inch. and the Israelites spent 40 years in the desert. Shazam! It's a correlation that is precise. It couldn't be any more precise. 40 is precisely 40. Can't argue with that extreme precision. So it is a precise correlation, but is it valid? Of course not. There is no real relationship or causation between the 40 years in the desert and 40 turns per inch on a micrometer. Without any valid causation, the precise correlation is just a logical fallacy. There are many other examples of precise correlations that have no causation. Here are some fancy graphs that depict precise correlations. Here is a graph showing the precise correlation between the total revenue generated by arcades and computer science doctorates awarded in the US. Shazam! It's a correlation. But does using the low standard of evidence of being a precise correlation validate the correlation without causation? Of course not. Here is a graph showing the precise correlation between autism and organic food sales. Shazam! It's a correlation. But does using the low standard of evidence of being a precise correlation validate the correlation without causation? Of course not. Here's a graph showing the precise correlation between per capita cheese consumption and the number of people who die by becoming entangled in their bed sheets. Shazam! It's a correlation. But does using the low standard of evidence of being a precise correlation validate the correlation without causation? Of course not. Here is a graph showing the precise correlation between fresh lemons imported to the United States from Mexico and total highway fatalities. How sad, yet shazam! It's a correlation. But does using the low standard of evidence of being a precise correlation validate the correlation without causation? Of course not. Here's a graph showing the precise correlation between the divorce rate in Maine and the per capita consumption of margarine. I hate it when margarine causes divorce. Shazam! It's a correlation. But does using the low standard of evidence of being a precise correlation validate the correlation without causation? Of course not. Here's a graph showing the precise correlation between the age of Miss America and murders by steam, hot vapors, and hot objects. Shazam! It's a correlation. But does using the low standard of evidence of being a precise correlation validate the correlation without causation? Of course not. This graph is often used to show that using precision as a way to validate a correlation is a low standard of evidence to be avoided. This graph shows the precise correlation between ice cream sales and shark attacks. Shazam! It's a correlation. But does using the low standard of evidence of being a precise correlation validate the correlation without causation? Of course not. Yes, Harley. I'm getting to your favorite precise correlation without causation. Here's a graph showing the precise correlation between the number of people who drowned by falling into pools and the number of films Nicolas Cage appeared in. Shazam! It's a correlation. If Nicolas Cage was in less movies, it would save lives, according to this precise correlation. But does using the low standard of evidence of being a precise correlation validate the correlation without causation? Of course not. There, are you happy now, Harley? And here is my favorite example of a correlation somehow validated using the low standard of evidence of precision. Here's a graph showing the precise correlation between the global average temperature compared to the number of pirates. This is the classic example used in classrooms and books demonstrating the folly of using the low standard of evidence of using precision as a research method to validate a correlation. You won't find any of this information about the low standard of evidence of using precision to validate a made-up correlation in Great Pyramid Correlation Without Causation books. Authors of these books are not going to tell their readers about this invalid research method used to somehow validate these made-up correlations without causation. Great Pyramid Correlation Without Causation believers scoff and say, I'm just comparing random stuff and the correlations are meaningless. Exactly. Even though the correlations are precise, there is no causation to validate these precise correlations. These correlations are like Great Pyramid correlations because none of these examples of precise correlations or even precise Great Pyramid correlations have causation. So, okay, now we will use this information to try to determine the standard of evidence used to somehow validate a perceived Great Pyramid correlation. The vents at one time, not now, were precisely pointing to supposedly significant stars. Therefore, in the minds of Great Pyramid Correlation Without Causation believers, the precision somehow validates the precise correlation. Shazam! It's a correlation. But does using the low standard of evidence of being a precise correlation validate the correlation without causation? Of course not. There is no causation or feature specific to the Great Pyramid which indicates the builders intended any relationship between the vents and so-called significant stars. No causation. The vents are and have pointed to many different stars very precisely. In fact, there is no feature specific to the Great Pyramid indicating the vents were built to point to anything. Vents being intended to point to something is just an unsubstantiated, made up assumption. Everything that points up points to stars. The Great Pyramid's capstone, if it had one, pointed up. The Empire State Building points up. The spikes on the Statue of Liberty point to the sky. All flagpoles point up. All hydroelectric dams have passages that point to stars. Just because something points up doesn't mean that it was intended to point to stars. To contend that vents were intended to point to stars is what is called in the realm of mainstream scholars as a correlation without causation and a low standard of evidence. The low standard of evidence of using precision to somehow validate a correlation makes this star vent correlation in reality just a plain old run-of-the-mill logical fallacy conjured up using flawed research methods. Let's look at another example of a perceived precise correlation comparing two things with each other. What about the precise correlation between the Great Pyramid sides and the cardinal directions? The sides of the Great Pyramid face the cardinal directions of a compass. This perceived correlation is precise. Does that make it intended to be significant? Correlation without causation believers who embrace low standards of evidence that this guy says we should avoid contend that yes, the precision indicates intended significance. Okay, then, what is the significance? No coherent answer is forthcoming for that question. When asked what the significance of that correlation is, people tell me the builders wanted to tell us something, like they knew which way was north, or they knew other stuff or whatever, and they wanted to tell us this or that in some kind of a profound, significant way. But all of that is just hokum they make up, but it has no substantiation based on direct physical evidence, nor is that interpretation derived using any high standard of evidence. Let's examine the direct physical evidence. The sides of the Great Pyramid face towards the cardinal directions. That's it. That is the evidence. A perceived correlation is not direct physical evidence. Perceived correlations are interpretations of the direct physical evidence. Perceived precise correlations can be either valid or invalid. Let's conjure up out of thin air some made up causation for this correlation between the sides of the Great Pyramid and the cardinal directions. Correlation believers do this type of thing all the time, so it is okay if we give it a try just to see how it works out. I'll make up an interpretation based on the direct physical evidence. The builders tried to have the corners of the Great Pyramid point to the cardinal directions, but they got it wrong. That is an interpretation of the direct physical evidence. What standard of evidence is used to validate or invalidate my interpretation of the evidence? Logically, my interpretation, or in other words, my correlation without causation, is just as valid as any other made up Great Pyramid correlation without causation. I'll make up another interpretation based on the same direct physical evidence. The alignment of the sides of the Great Pyramid did not matter at all. The builders did not give a care at all about the alignment of the sides of the Great Pyramid. They could have built the Great Pyramid with any orientation at all because the orientation didn't matter and had no significance. So, what they did was just build the Great Pyramid square to the world because the alignment of the sides had no religious or symbolic significance at all. Is that interpretation valid or invalid? To answer that question requires examining the research methods used to come up with that Great Pyramid correlation I just made up. But discussing research methods would shed light on the poor research methods used to pull these Great Pyramid correlations without causation out of a hat. Just saying that a perceived correlation is valid and significant because it is precise is a low standard of evidence and results in logical fallacies. Remember, this guy wants us to avoid low standards of evidence rejected by mainstream scholars and use high standards of evidence embraced by mainstream scholars. That makes sense. Here is some advice that is consistent with this quote from this guy. If you encounter a researcher or a book author that contends that precision somehow validates a correlation, then you should run away.
Run away! Run away! Run away!
Avoid that researcher or author like the plague. If a researcher or even someone who posts on Facebook says that a correlation is valid because it is precise, run away!
Run away! Run away! Run away!
But wait, there's more. There is another low standard of evidence that the Orion correlation theory uses as a research technique necessary, yes, I said necessary, to conjure up and somehow validate, at least in their own minds, correlations without causation. This additional poor research technique must be utilized so that researchers who use low standards of evidence can come up with Great Pyramid correlations without causation. Remember, a correlation is comparing two things. When people who use poor research techniques want to conjure up a correlation, they want to have many things to compare, lots of things. In fact, people who are in the business of making up correlations have a vested interest in there being as many things, ideas, data points, units of measure, or whatever to compare with some other thing, idea, or data point. This allows researchers who use low standards of evidence to have more opportunities to compare unrelated data points that may or may not result in a correlation that may or may not be precise, and then proclaim, Shazam! It's a correlation. This additional low standard of evidence, which is indispensable to the Orion correlation theory, is called cherry picking. In the realm of mainstream research, scholars try to reduce the variables involved when comparing two things or performing an experiment. Yet, in the Orion correlation theory, they habitually increase the variables to include absolutely every conceivable unit of measure, every data point, or feature of everything that has ever existed, and every conceivable concept as a data pool to draw from in comparing one unrelated thing to another unrelated thing to come up with correlations without causation. Yes, it is true. If you don't believe me, ask a Great Pyramid correlation believer, what are the things that cannot be compared to the Great Pyramid? You will get a blank expression and no coherent answer will be forthcoming. This is because correlation believers instinctively know that there is a foundational need to cherry pick unrelated pieces of data from every conceivable source to conjure up these fake Great Pyramid correlations. In contrast, mainstream scholars know that cherry picking is a low standard of evidence and produces logical fallacies. Yet the Orion correlation theory embraces this low standard of evidence of cherry picking as a foundational research technique. Using cherry picking is a direct contradiction to this quote from this guy. The reality is that the Orion correlation theory is the most grandiose and grotesque cherry picking scenario ever conceived by the human mind. What, Harley? What do you want? What do you got there? You've got a what? A top 6 list? You've got a top 6 list, huh? How come we don't have a top 10 list? He says our budget won't allow it. The category of our top 6 list is low standards of evidence used by the Orion correlation theory. Okay, we're going to start out. Number 6, circular reasoning. This one is so obvious that we didn't even spend any time on it, but it is widely used to justify made-up Great Pyramid correlations without causation. Here is a quote from the book Stargate Conspiracy discussing the flawed circular reasoning used to somehow justify Great Pyramid star alignments. Quote, however, some of Bhavall's assumptions are open to question. For example, he presents a very circular argument that uses the stellar alignments of the shafts to prove the date of the Great Pyramid, but also relies on this date to prove that the shafts have stellar alignments. This is classic circular reasoning, unquote. Wow. I guess it isn't just me that finds fault in Great Pyramid correlations without causation based on examining the research methods used to make up these dubious correlations. Okay, number 5. Contending that many correlations without causation validate many correlations without causation. If you have come up with a whole bunch of logical fallacies, that does not mean that all the logical fallacies are valid. Number 4, contending a correlation is valid because it is precise. Yes, that's a big one. Mainstream scholars don't use that low standard of evidence, yet the Orion correlation theory relies heavily on this low standard of evidence. It is too bad that a lot of people who have read Great Pyramid correlation books have been misinformed because that low standard of evidence was used to come up with fake correlations. Shame on you, Great Pyramid correlation without causation book authors who have deceived people using this low standard of evidence. Tisk, tisk, tisk. Number 3, cherry picking. cherry picking unrelated data points to conjure up correlations without causation, creating logical fallacies. Yes, Harley, that is a common logical fallacy and a standard operating practice of the Orion correlation theory to manufacture fake, made up Great Pyramid correlations without causation. Number two, the common logical fallacy of correlations without causation. You are correct, Harley. Number three and number two are the twin gods of the Orion correlation theory mystery religion. Logical fallacies derived using these two low standards of evidence is the foundation of the Orion correlation theory is built on. And the number one low standard of evidence for the Orion correlation theory is, drum roll please, not rim shot, drum roll please, the absolute refusal to understand and use valid research techniques, resulting in low standards of evidence, which produce logical fallacies. This number one reason is exasperated by the absolute refusal of Orion correlation theory book authors and Great Pyramid correlation without causation proponents to discuss, understand, and reject the poor research methods and low standards of evidence used by the Orion correlation theory. Thank you, Harley. That was a nice top 10 list. You did a great job of making it. Certainly, there are other poor research techniques that the Orion correlation theory and many more examples of the logical fallacies these low standards of evidence produce. But right now, I want to take the time to brag on Harley for a minute. When I first met Harley, he was a mess. He was an addict, and his addiction was very strong. He was suffering with the burden of his addiction. Well, he mustered the courage to go through our AA 12-step program designed for his addiction. It was a struggle for him, but he was able to graduate from our 12-step AA program, and he has broken free from his addiction. I'm so proud of you, Harley. Our AA program is called Alignment Anonymous, and it is designed to help people break free from their addiction to nonsensical Great Pyramid alignments and false correlations made up by modern people using low standards of evidence. I'm proud to say we have not only helped Harley, but we have helped a lot of other people through our Alignment Anonymous 12-step program. Well, it's about time to wrap this up. It was fun while it lasted, and there was so much more to discuss. We touched on a number of flawed research techniques that are the standard operating procedure of not only the Orion correlation theory, but all theories that come up with fake Great Pyramid correlations without causation. So I'm not just focusing on the Orion correlation theory, but all theories that use these same low standards of evidence to make up fake Great Pyramid correlations. Here is the mindset of Great Pyramid correlation believers. Great Pyramid correlation believers rely on the false notion that precision validates a correlation. Then they contend that there are just so many of these correlations without causation that have been made up, that they must all be valid. Wow, that is some poor research methods and low standards of evidence. It is only the Orion correlation theory that you hear people contend that since there are so many logical fallacies, correlations without causation, that the logical fallacies, correlations without causation, must all be true. No wonder the Orion correlation theory or any of those made up fake Great Pyramid correlation theories will never be embraced by real scholars who are well versed in using high standards of evidence. Legitimate academic scholars can recognize a low standard of evidence from a mile away. It is these types of low standards of evidence that this guy wants us to avoid, which have caused mainstream scholars to resoundingly reject the logical fallacies of made up fake Great Pyramid correlations without causation. In review, The Orion correlation theory uses low standards of evidence. These low standards of evidence include embracing correlations without causation. Also, the Orion correlation theory contends that a perceived correlation that is precise is valid. The Orion correlation theory utilizes circular reasoning, and the Orion correlation theory relies heavily on using cherry picking to compare unrelated data points to manufacture fake correlations without causation. All of these low standards of evidence are obviously rejected by mainstream scholars. Correlation believers rely heavily on these manufactured correlations being precise to provide validation, but that low standard of evidence is a flawed research method rejected by mainstream scholars. Precision does not validate a correlation. Mainstream scholars will never embrace the Orion correlation theory, not because the correlations are not precise, as we have seen, and as mainstream scholars know, all fake made-up correlations without causation are precise. Precision does not validate a correlation in the realm of mainstream scholarly research. Precision does not even imply a correlation was intended to be significant. The general public will catch up with mainstream scholars and also reject the Orion correlation without causation theory. People will come to understand the flawed research methods and low standards of evidence that the Orion correlation theory is based on and simply reject these correlations without causation made up by modern people. This is why it is absolutely imperative that Great Pyramid correlation without causation believers will do anything to keep from discussing the research methods used in the Orion correlation theory. To allow a discussion about these research techniques will expose the fatal flaws that has doomed this correlation theory, relegating it into the realm of mystery religions. The Orion correlation theory will be thrown into the ash heap of rejected ideas, suffering both the same fate as both phrenology and pyramidology. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, and we are adding videos every so often. Visit our website at www.thepump.org. You can contact me through email from that site. If you have a radio show you would like to interview me on, let us know by email through our website. Read my books if you get a chance. Lost Technologies of the Great Pyramid is my first book about the Great Pyramid water pump. This book describes how the Great Pyramid water pump was assembled using water locks and barges. The Great Pyramid Prosperity Machine is my second book about the Great Pyramid water pump. This book describes in detail how the Great Pyramid operated as an efficient water pumping system. Both books are available in softcover or Kindle ebook format. Here is my first documentary about the Great Pyramid water pump, titled How the Great Pyramid Was Built Using Water Locks and Barges. It depicts in detail, using many computer-generated animations, how the Great Pyramid was assembled using water locks, barges, and the buoyancy of water. Here is my second documentary describing in detail how the Great Pyramid operated as a water pump. It is a fascinating water pumping process depicted using many animations. The links for these items are on the screen and in the description of this YouTube video. Thank you, Harley, for all the help in the control room. Without your help, this video about the poor research methods of the Orion correlation theory could not have been created. That is all for now. Thank you for watching, and good night.